It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, fellow Quillers, to another astounding episode of your favorite Shakespeare authorship mystery podcast. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the series the man who holds the title second to my wife for having appeared more times on Don't Quill the Messenger than any other guest. You know him, you love him, you're thrilled that he is back. He is Dr. Earl Showerman. Earl, here you are.
Man, so glad to be back, Stephen. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, awesome to have you. It's been a while. I mean, we've seen each other, we've talked with each other, but it's been a while since you've been on the show, and we have an exciting topic to get to today that actually, just in reading some of the stuff you advanced to me, I learned new things about this play that I didn't know, and I can't wait to share those with the listeners in this episode as well, because there's some really profound stuff that you have put together, and then you shared with me that you've been studying this play for a very long time.
20 years, Stephen. It was 20 years ago, this very month, that I submitted the first paper I ever wrote as a Shakespeare research paper to my class at Southern Oregon University. I had only been retired for about 8 or 9 months, and I dove right into the Shakespeare studies. And in that class, my instructor, Liz Eckhart, fabulous teacher, she struts in and on day one, and she says, okay, Shakespeare biography, doesn't tell us anything about the place. Let's start. Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 1. Who's there? What a great start.
I always call it the longest knock-knock joke in history.
Well, I was blessed by her open-mindedness because she approved my progress on what I began to research. I was curious about the parallels between the Greek tragedy and Shakespearean tragedy, and in particular, the story of Hamlet, and that as Orestes, as expressed in Aeschylus's trilogy, the Oresteia, and also in the Orestes plays of Sophocles and Euripides. So I went into the Henson library when it was time to start doing research on my Hamlet paper, and I entered in one field Hamlet, and in the second field Orestes, pushed enter, and my life changed and hasn't been the same for the past 20 years.
Well, we've talked about this before, and I know a lot of my listeners know this, and I credit you. I say that you're the guy who has basically single-handedly proven that the author of the plays was not only well-versed in the Greek tragedies, but also, I would say, a Greek file. A Grecophile?
A Grecophile,
yes,
of course. Yeah.
Because I believe that he had such a love for the craft of theater that he had an affinity for those great Greek masters who brought it to us and shaped it and for all intents and purposes, shaped Western culture through their art. And I think it plays out in so many of the plays. But I never realized until, like I said, looking at some of the stuff you sent me and what we're going to talk about today, how much of that element can be found in this, the greatest of them all, Hamlet. I've always looked at it as more of an autobiographical play. I've always looked at it as more of a topical play of what was happening in his life at the time when it was being written and rewritten. And I believe it was written and rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. But you have some really interesting, fun stuff that you've been studying about for 20 years with this Orestes connection.
Yes.
I don't know how many of the listeners are really familiar with the Oresteia and the story of Orestes. So let's begin there a little bit, give them a little bit of background to that, so that when we talk about how that plays out in Hamlet, they have some context.
Absolutely. Well, the Oresteia, the trilogy that was performed in 458 BC, is the only extant trilogy we have of the Greek drama. The Greek plays were performed during the Dionysia festivals, and there were trilogy competitions, and a certain number of playwrights, 4 or 5 perhaps, were then licensed and then provided with companies and funding to produce these trilogies. And the only one from the hundreds and hundreds that must have been performed during those Dionysia festivals have arrived and come back to us. So the Oresteia is basically the story of, at the end of the Trojan War, the first of the trilogy is the Agamemnon. And there's amazing parallels between the Agamemnon and Macbeth in particular. But this is the story of Agamemnon returning to Greece after victory in Troy, but having sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia in order to launch his army on that war 10 years earlier. He comes home. His wife Clytemnestra has been plotting against him. She has allied herself with Aegisthus. He is Agamemnon's nephew by his brother Thyestes, who was actually the adulterous progeny, and they murder.
So the apple didn't fall far from the tree.
No,
Right?
And they murder Agamemnon and Cassandra, of course, at the end of the play, and because of the plot that Clytemnestra has laid for him. They murder him by throwing a net on top of him and stabbing him repeatedly in the tub. This is Clytemnestra leading the way. She comes out and shows the bloody net and the knives that she used. So the exposure of bloody knives in this play is very similar to what you see in Macbeth, of course. Well, that ends the Agamemnon. Then the second play is the so-called libation bearers, or the Coephori, which is Orestes coming home 20 years later as a young man, being advised by the god Apollo to come back and revenge himself on his murderous mother, Clytemnestra, and to reunite with his sister Electra. And there's a scene at the beginning of the libation bearers. It's very much like the scene in Hamlet, where Horatio and Hamlet appear and see the burial of Ophelia with the court coming there. There's an exact parallel with that passage in the libation bearers, where Electra comes to offer offerings at her father Agamemnon's grave, and that's where Orestes returns and is acknowledged, and then he proceeds, of course, with his plan, and with Electra's help, they assassinate Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. And at the very end, he shows the bloody net they used to kill Agamemnon and the bloody knives that he used to kill them. And then, of course, he sees the Furies, and they drive him crazy. And the Furies are the vengeful, female entities that are, say you've killed your mother, then you must suffer. So the last of the 3 plays, which is the Eumenides, which means the friends, is what the Furies become at the very end. Orestes flees to Apollo's oracle, and Apollo advises him to go to Athens and to appeal to Athena to have a trial on the Areopagos, which is the hill in Athens where murders are tried, with a jury of his peers. And so the Furies are the prosecuting attorneys, and Apollo is his defense attorney, and there's a full-scale trial that goes on, and Hamlet Act 5, there's the number of legalisms in that part of the play is pretty phenomenal. But there's a trial of Orestes there. Apollo pleads that Orestes, Clytemnestra is not the mother of the child. The parent of the child is the father, because he plants the seed in the woman. She simply, nourishes it, and it's harvested that way.
Yeah, that probably wouldn't go over so well today, I don't think.
Well, consider your audience was 50,000 or 30,000 men, no women in the audience, right? So you can get away with that argument. In any case, it's a split jury. And Athena has the opportunity to consider the evidence and suggest that, no, Orestes was following the dictate of the god, and so he must be exonerated for the sin of killing his mother.
But isn't he banished, though, from becoming king of his kingdom?
It depends on the story.
In his father's stead, because, Aegisthus basically is the usurper, right? And then when Orestes slays Aegisthus and his mother, who was queen,
yes,
he's now the prince. He should become king, but doesn't he get banished?
He does not. There's actually no description of what happens to him. Now, in the Tudor interlude, Orestes, he marries Hermione and becomes king. So in the Tudor interlude that's performed, it's based on the original story. He does actually marry the princess and become king of Mycenae. However, his fate is not so clear. What's clear at the end is that Athena offers a rhetorical conviction. She convinces the Furies to give up their vengeance against Orestes and to become the friends and to have a special grove of trees in Athens. And so it's a resolution that creates positive results all the way around. The fate of Orestes is not described in the original Aeschylus story. Now, the medieval renditions of the story, the Troy book by Lydgate and Caxton's books and the French romances that deal with the Troy, they give ongoing other aspects of the story, and that's where the Tudor interlude, Orestes, comes in, because it sort of is based on the same storyline of the vengeful son coming home and murdering the mother or killing the one who murdered his father. But it's done in a very, very, very different style from what eventually becomes Hamlet. But people like David Bevington, Marie Axton, and others have suggested that the Tudor interlude, which was performed in 1567, at Gray's Inn, when the Earl of Oxford was 17 years old and was matriculated to Gray's Inn, was performed, and that play was an immediate response to the deposition of Mary Queen of Scots and the murder of her husband, Lord Darnley, by the man who would become her lover, Lord Bothwell, the James Hepburn, the 6th Earl of Bothwell, so he was called Lord Bothwell, that they conspired to murder the King of Scotland, her husband, the Stuart Lord Darnley, and then she married the Bothwell 3 months after the murder of her husband.
So here's Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. He's just graduated from Oxford University. Cambridge, was it Cambridge first and then Oxford?
Correct.
Yeah, so he's just graduated from Oxford. He's in his first year of law school at the age of 17 at Gray's Inn.
Right.
And we know that a lot of these court dramas, funny that we call them court dramas because many of them were actually performed at the Inns of Court,
right,
which were the law schools. Something that we covered at our recent symposium in Minneapolis to a lot of detail is that these performances were being performed in front of judges and lawyers and law students very often at these Inns of Court. And it would make sense that a performance like the Orestes being performed at that time in this very topical way, right, because there's this obsession with Mary Queen of Scots going on, because she does have a pseudo claim to the English crown. And there's all this conflict between Elizabeth and her cousin Mary. And now suddenly Mary's got this huge chink in her armor that it appears as though she has conspired with her lover to murder her husband, not unlike Clytemnestra conspires with to murder her husband Agamemnon.
You got it exactly, Stephen. I mean, it's highly topical. I mean, there was a huge concern because that she's a Catholic and allied with the French court. Was formerly married to King Francis of France, who died, and then she took over as queen in Scotland. And this is all within just a few months of the birth of King James. So he's an infant while all this is going on, because it's quite remarkable. Let me give you a little bit more background on Mary Queen of Scots, the history of
Is there
her.
Any chance that James is actually a bastard, that he's actually the son of Bothwell?
I'm sure that there's some propagandists that would suggest as much, but I think probably not. I think he probably is Lord Darnley's son. She was definitely interested in Darnley, but he was like, Bothwell was like Claudius. He was profligate and all that. Darnley was a narcissist and a power-hungry sort of guy, according to John Guy in his recent biography of Mary Queen of Scots.
Why does Mary want him dead other than she just wants to be with her lover? Maybe he was abusive. Maybe he was a a horrible tyrant?
Well,
of a husband?
they were in conflict quite a bit, especially after the birth of King James. Really, what Darnley wanted to do was put Mary Queen of Scots aside and become King of Scotland, and he felt that he was entitled to this. She, on the other hand, had some real problems with him, and one of the problems that she had with him was that he appeared to have picked up syphilis along the way. And that prior to his coming back to Edinburgh, where he was ultimately assassinated after a failed bombing attempt on the home where he was living, he had treatment for secondary syphilis, which was rampant during
She
that
should have
time.
just let him be. He probably would have gone mad and died on his own.
I don't think you could expect that, because tertiary syphilis might take 20 or 30 years.
Oh, okay.
They were plotting against each other. They were in conflict over the throne and the power, according to John Guy. And I have a lot more reading to do in terms of preparing a good paper on this. But it seems to me that they became alienated because of his power hungriness and trying to set her aside, and also his own profligacy. Now, one of the people involved in this whole melodrama, and it really was a melodrama that was occurring in the 1567-68 period of time, was the fate of David Rizzio, who was the Italian singer, musician who became Mary Queen of Scots' confidant and intimate. He replaced her affections that she formerly had toward Darnley to David Rizzio. And you've seen this in several of the films about the Mary Queen of Scots, in which Rizzio is assassinated, by the Scottish lords in the Queen's bedchamber, just like Polonius, the advisor in Hamlet, gets, stabbed in the Queen's chamber. The difference is that Rizzio was stabbed 57 times.
Holy moly.
And the last knife to go into him was Lord Darnley's knife. And he had colluded with the Scottish lords to get rid of Rizzio, because he was jealous of him, because he had become an intimate of the Queen in ways. And there's a suggestion that he had actually homosexual relationships with Darnley. So there was a bit of a melodrama that was going on that had romantic.
Maybe he gave Darnley the syphilis.
Well, who knows where that came from. But when Rizzio was killed, that turned Mary Queen of Scots definitely against Darnley and vengeful toward him in some regards. Now, whether she was having an affair with Bothwell before Darnley's death is hard to say. There's a lot of propaganda that came out, including what's called the casket letters that were obtained by Cecil's agent and brought to Cecil in England by Moray and some of the other Scottish lords, which had letters that suggested Mary Queen of Scots and Bothwell had been in some conspiracy, to eliminate Lord Darnley. So it's really hard to learn exactly the facts of what was going on, because there was propaganda on both sides. And the main person bringing about the dossier of papers against Bothwell and Mary Queen of Scots was George Buchanan. Well, Buchanan's kind of important in this regard because he was King James's tutor. He was the foremost Latinist of the time. He was Montaigne's tutor also. He translated the Alcestis into Latin from the Greek, which was, of course, the source for both The Winter's Tale and Much Ado About Nothing. The final scenes of those two plays are based on. So he was a foremost Latinist, but he was very much involved with the Scottish lords in creating the paper trail to incriminate Mary Queen of Scots and suggest very strongly that she was in a romantic relationship with Bothwell, and that together they plotted what became the attempt and then the assassination of Lord
It's really
Darnley.
interesting because you can look at the story from two different perspectives, right? You can look at it and say, okay, well, Darnley was obviously power hungry. And if Elizabeth, and putting this reflection, so if you're Elizabeth and you know all of this, because she must have, it's just another reason to never get married, right? Because her cousin gets married and her cousin's husband is trying to steal the throne from her.
Yeah.
And that was something Elizabeth was definitely terrified would happen if she married, was that her husband would suddenly have some sort of dominance over her and try to act as king. And so if you look at it from that perspective, you go, well, Mary had a reason to kill her husband.
Yes, she did.
And she needed an ally to help her do it. Also, another reason is revenge for his murder of her trusted advisor, whom she obviously had great affection for. So she has two really legitimate reasons for murdering her husband, but because of the Protestant fear of her Catholic nature and her potential claim to the throne, they needed to propagandize and paint her to be the Wicked Witch of the West, as it were.
Absolutely. And Cecil, there was no one more responsible for her downfall than William Cecil. Okay, he's the one that collected the dossier from Buchanan and published a bunch of anonymous pamphlets attacking Mary Queen of Scots. And she's likened to Clytemnestra in speeches to Parliament during that time. So the connection between the Orestes stories and the evil Clytemnestra who kills her king, her husband, the king, is paralleled in popular literature during that same time. So the connection is absolutely
and the parallels there
impeccable.
are incredible, because now let's look at Clytemnestra and look at the two ways to view her. So here she is deceived by her husband Agamemnon into bringing her daughter forward to be sacrificed to the gods. Her first child, the love of her life, her eldest daughter. And he deceives her in order to get her to bring the daughter, and then sacrifices her so that he can go off and conquest. Disappears for 10 years, comes back with a girlfriend, Cassandra, who is much younger and much more beautiful, though she's definitely crazy, right? 'Cause she's been the one who's been touched by Apollo and has all these prophecies but the curse is that no one will ever believe her, right?
Right.
And so, here's Clytemnestra going, you slew our daughter, and then you come back with this harlot. I'm going to get me a boyfriend and I'm going to kill you. Yeah. And so there's a lot of reasons for Clytemnestra to be absolved of her action too.
That's the beautiful thing about Greek drama and about Shakespearean drama. The moral position is sometimes hard to maintain.
Very blurry.
Yeah, and I think that Mary Queen of Scots was actually, Elizabeth was interested in protecting her at this point. It was the Scottish lords and Cecil and Throckmorton and Leicester that all wanted to do away with Mary Queen of Scots because of her Catholicism and the threat that she posed to the actual, throne of England. Should Elizabeth be deposed for whatever reason or assassinated, Mary Queen of Scots would have a real claim to the throne.
Indeed.
And then you're back at the time of Bloody Mary Tudor. So, right. So they had legitimate fears for that. So there was a real delicate balancing act going on. And so the fact that this Tudor interlude, Orestes, was topical, apparently, according to Kerrigan, John Kerrigan, and David Bevington, the great Shakespeare scholar David Bevington, and Marie Axton, who actually printed up an edition of the Tudor Interludes and was an expert in this area, that this is very topical of Mary Queen of Scots. And it's an ambivalent position about what do you do with someone who's, has justification for committing regicide. Basically, it's a question of justifiable regicide in this case. You go back to the topical historical influence, and we're talking in the 1560s here now, late 1560s, is that Rizzio and Polonius were both thrown into a stairwell. Now, there's a detail here that's very, very interesting, that both counselors were discovered or thrown into stairwells, and both suffered very, very minimal funerary things. In the Agamemnon, the great horror to Electra is that her father, Agamemnon, never got proper burial. There was burial without ceremony. Well, the same thing happens, of course, with in Hamlet, where there is very little of acknowledgement. I mean, Gertrude remarries within months of the death of her husband, and Hamlet is torn apart by this. The fact that there wasn't sufficient burial ceremonial.
He specifically has a line. I'm very familiar with those lines.
Yes,
he specifically has a line, within a month.
Yeah, within a month.
Within a month.
Yeah.
And as we learn from the legal ramifications of that, there are some very specific hereditary rights that are in question if she marries that quickly, because suddenly then her new husband has a claim to lands and leases that her son no longer has, because he developed that claim prior to the time period that we would require for a son to obtain his rights. And the law says that a king's claim stands above anyone else's claim, even if they have an equal claim. So by marrying Claudius, Gertrude basically eliminates her son's claim to any hereditary lands or leases of his father.
Certainly that was true in the Norwegian and Danish courts, that these were not primogeniture driven, inheritance of the kingship. You had to kind of earn it or be elected by the leading nobility in those countries, unlike England or France, where primogeniture was the ruling condition.
But the double reflection of Mary, Queen of Scots, marrying her lover within 3 months of the death of her husband.
Right.
And then, of course, we all know about the autobiographical aspect of Marjorie Golding, Edward de Vere's mother, marrying so quickly after the death of his father. So there's like these triple layers going on here.
There is.
In this comparison to this ancient Greek story.
It's just so wrapped up, and Shakespeare, of course, is the most self-consciously literate author in the entire world literature, I don't know how many sources, but over 200 certainly were literary sources where they can. And in Hamlet, these are woven in especially a lot of classical sources, but the parallels to the plot and the parallels to the characters that you find in the Oresteia and in Hamlet are quite remarkable and worthy of acknowledgement. I did write the article in the Oxfordian. It was published in 2004. In case some of your listeners want to access that, it is available on the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website. So through the previous, but it was a good argument, I think. And what really strikes me now is that the fact that the first Hamlet reference was in Thomas Nash's introduction to Robert Greene's novel, his euphuistic novel, published in August of 1589, referring to whole Hamlets, of tragical speeches in the English Seneca, obviously a reference to a dramatic production. And of course, Xenophon was directed to the students of Oxford and Cambridge. And of course, in the first quarto, you have the preface on the cover page say this play was performed for the students at both Oxford and Cambridge University. So all those things are there. Now, the other thing, Stephen, and I cannot confirm this myself, is that Xenophon, Robert Greene's book that references through Nash the whole Hamlets and the English Seneca, was dedicated to Jane Hales, Lady Jane Hales. I believe she's a surviving widow of Sir James Hales, who is the man involved in the trial of Hales v. Pettit that's developed in Act 5 of Hamlet, the drowning of Ophelia, and whether somebody committing suicide or not could be doing. That was Hales v. Pettit.
Yes.
Tried. Now, Hales was a justice at what? Gray's Inn, where the Earl of Oxford, where Orestes was performed. I mean, this is all insider stuff. This is dedicated to Jane Hales. I cannot confirm that she is, in fact, the widow that unsuccessfully sued for recovery of her lands because of the loss of after he had committed suicide during the reign of Mary Queen of
What a crazy circle that would be, and how much more that just proves that no country bumpkin from Stratford would have ever been in those circles, could have ever possibly traveled in those circles, could have possibly known these people or the personalities or the details of their lives to this extent. But a student of Gray's Inn, especially during that time of study, would definitely have all of that inside knowledge.
It was a hotbed of classical reinvention of translations. I mean, who was affiliated with Gray's Inn? Well, you got Bacon, you've got both Bacon brothers, of course, Arthur Golding, Arthur Hall, George Gaskin, George Chapman, all these, Studley, Haywood, all these people who were translating the classics were all part of this coterie of young people. And those translators, the guys that were contributing to the Seneca's 10 Tragedies, most of them were in their late teens and early 20s when they did their translations. This was a young, vibrant, active academic and theatrical community. The whole scene at Gray's Inn must have been just quite fascinating.
And you could see them all sitting around a table somewhere as Tranio says in Taming of the Shrew, strive, do as adversaries do in law, strive mightily, but eat and drink as friends. And you could see them all sitting around a table, eating and drinking and getting into, it happens with me and my friends. We sit around a table eating and drinking and we debate why the Earl of Oxford this or how the play reflects that. But here were these guys sitting around eating and drinking and probably debating, was Clytemnestra justified? Was Electra and Orestes justified in murdering their stepfather and their mother?
Yeah.
And just talking for hours and like twisting it around. And especially from a legal standpoint, these are the types of debates in legal philosophy that lead to arguments in courts of law in real cases moving forward.
Right. Right. Well, you think of it, lawyers, the barristers who take the bar and present cases and all that, they have to be gifted in rhetoric like an actor is.
Mm-hmm.
They're performing for the court, unlike for another kind of audience. So the training in dramatic arts and music and literature at the law schools was phenomenal. And it goes back to the Knights Templar because they occupied those Inner Temple and the Gray's Inn and the Middle Temple, Lincoln, and they were all Templar places before the, king, came along and said, we're no longer a Catholic country, Henry VIII, and says, I want all these properties and I'll turn these over to law schools. And that's really how they evolved. So they were part of the ongoing theatrical festival tradition that came from the native culture, the morality plays.
There's still a Templar chapel at Middle Temple Hall, and there's a great statue there on top of sort of a Egyptian obelisk of the two Templars riding the same horse, two men of a horse, to emphasize that they were committed to poverty, quote, air quotes, because they were so that, the whole order was so wealthy, but they were committed to poverty so that not all of the knights could even afford their own horse, right? Is the symbolism there? And that still exists to this day right there. In fact, they used it in one of the Dan Brown movies, I want to say.
I'm sure that's true. And it's so wonderful to see the layering and the how history and philosophy and literature and drama and politics all get mixed up because with Shakespeare, you've got all those elements entering it. Now, here's one other thing I learned recently, reading Nina Green's online site on the Earl of Oxford's history and all that. In 1565, King James had proposed to come to England to negotiate the release of his mother, who had basically been under house arrest in England for almost 20 years. It was like 15 years at that time, 15, 16 years. And this is based on a letter from Mendoza, the Spanish ambassador. And a hostage situation would be required for King James to safely come to England and trust that the English would treat him and his mother with respect.
There needed to be an exchange.
The exchange person to be offered was the Earl of Oxford in 1565. Okay? It's amazing, isn't it? I just learned that he was going to be offered as the person to go to Scotland and be in Edinburgh, while King James was going to be negotiating the release of his mother in England.
I love to see the documentation that proves that. But it would make so much sense, especially when we do have the letter from Mary, Queen of Scots, to Elizabeth accusing her of having an affair with Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. Ooh. There's something to the degree where she says, even the Earl of Oxford was afraid to sleep with his own wife out of fear of losing you as a lover. And so Mary condemns Elizabeth for that affair. Well, if James would obviously be aware of that too, so why not ask that the Queen send her favorite boy to vouchsafe his security while in England trying to negotiate a hostage deal? That makes total sense.
It makes total. And here, 1566 June, Oxford gets his annuity, £1,000 for the rest of his life. Okay. 3 months later, Mary Queen of Scots goes on trial at Fotheringay Castle, and guess who's in the sitting on the jury? Right. Earl of Oxford. That's 1587, right? 1586, 87. Yeah, and so during that time, Oxford was having a lot of family issues. He lost his daughter Frances about that same time, And then in 1588, he lost his wife. Okay, Anne Cecil dies during the time of the Spanish Armada is coming, and the Spanish Armada comes because of what? The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. That was the trigger for the whole Spanish-English war during that time. And the Earl of Oxford is in the mix both as a potential hostage, as a person who's sitting on her trial, and as a father who just lost his wife and one of his daughters. It's an amazing time for him politically and emotionally. And I can think of that writing of Hamlet during that time as an homage to his queen, and talking about what would justify regicide. So something as evil as Claudius could be written. Now, we do have the 1589 date for a production, at least prior to that, at some point, of a Hamlet. And that's why I think Hamlet is likely to have been written in the 1588-1589 time frame that Cairncross and Bloom and a handful of scholars accept as actually Shakespeare's Hamlet rather than the so-called Ur-Hamlet that Malone and other scholars have dreamed up, thinking that Thomas Kidd, who we don't know ever wrote a play about Hamlet, there's no documentation at all, wrote that play. So we have a Shakespearean Hamlet or an Oxfordian Hamlet from the late 1580s, and I believe it's in some ways his first effort, one of his first efforts, having received the annuity, he's paying back the queen by creating a drama that raises the moral questions of justifiable regicide and presents a case where a hero can be, of course, in the Hamlet myth, Hamlet survives and goes on to marry and be a successful king. Whereas in this story, with Shakespeare's stories, of course, he has to turn into a
I love
tragedy.
So you have all of these sources coming together. You have this knowledge and connection to the great Greek masters and the Greek tragedy. Right. Then you have this very topical reference of actual things going on with regards to Mary, Queen of Scots. Then you have Elizabeth, who was, by all accounts, against the killing of Mary.
Right.
And pushed it off and held it back. And there's some evidence that she signed the death warrant, not knowing she'd signed the death warrant. I would assume that based on Oxford and based on the Shakespearean canon and based on all of the Shakespearean writings, from the sonnets to the epic poems, there is a flavor there to me that says that the slaying of an anointed queen is like the biggest no-no in the world. It's like the greatest sin you could possibly. And so I feel that Oxford was against Mary's execution. But once it happens, you're right, he has to sort of help the country get through it because it's done now.
Yes.
And I think that you see that reflected in Macbeth. And I think that now that you mention it, now that you're opening my eyes to how much it is reflected in Hamlet, especially when he talks about, and he's standing over Claudius and he's ready to do it. And Claudius is praying and he says, well, I can't dispatch him while he's in prayer. He goes to heaven. My father didn't get that chance. My father didn't get to go to heaven. He has to be doing some type of a sin to make it worth it, to make it viable, to make it justifiable.
There you go.
And that's why it's not till the end when he has attempted another poisoning,
right,
that he slays him.
I know.
Double slays him, right? Stabs him and makes him drink the rest of the poison.
After everybody else is on its way out. Yeah. No, it's and the fact that William Cecil was so involved in the in the propaganda campaign against Mary Stuart, against Mary Queen of Scots, and was critical to this, to the naming of his minister in the first quarto, Corambus, which is obviously playing on Polonius's, on Burleigh's name, his motto, cor unum via uno, one heart, one way, Corambus meaning split heart or double-hearted, okay. So and I believe Q1 is probably close to the text of what was being performed in 1589.
I'd like to know what the conversation was like and how the deal was struck that forced him to change the name of the character. Did Elizabeth come to him and say, that one's too close to home, Eddie? You need to change it. Or like what made him go from Corambus, which is obviously so Cecil
Well,
to Polonius.
Okay, Stephen, we would never have known that the name Corymbus even existed were it not for the one complete copy of Q1 that we have. It was not discovered until the 19th century. Okay, so we only had the folio version and the longer second quarto, which uses Polonius as his name. We only have one complete copy of that Q of the first quarto, which I think probably was the original text or closer to it. And Eddie Jolly's book on the two quartos of Hamlet would suggest that Q1 with the Corymbus name is likely to have been the predecessor before the longer version, which is almost twice as long as you know, and much more artistically, and the soliloquies and all that are so much more elaborate and beautifully expressed. So I think the affiliation with Corymbus brought it too close to Mary Queen of Scots and what was going on with her in the late 1580s and 1590s. Now we know there was a production of Hamlet in 1593 in Oxford. There's a sign that proves it. In 1594 at Newington Butts, Titus Andronicus, Hamlet, and the Taming of Ashrew was performed according to Henslow's diaries. So we have numerous references to early Hamlets from the early 1590s, mid 1590s. And that 1589 reference by Nash. So I think the early Hamlet was closer, more political. The name Corymbus was then used for Polonius, and that was changed at some point, obviously, and probably to create a greater dissociation from the court.
And at that time, as you mentioned earlier, you have a man who is grieving horribly.
Yeah.
Right? We know that he went through the estrangement with Anne, but they had reunited. Happily, from all accounts that we can tell. And I think when you look at the canon, there are so many apology plays where he is glorifying her in so many of the characters because he feels so horrible for the way he treated her in those earlier years of their marriage. And now she's gone.
Right.
And if you're talking about 1 year later, and he's stabbing his father-in-law to death in this play. And it's vengeful. It's very vengeful. And he's not killing him, but he's figuratively killing him. And yes, there is the parallel to the Rizzio thing that you talked about, which I was unaware of, that I had no idea. Talk about a big revelation. And the idea that, Hamlet drags Polonius's body and leaves him in the stairwell.
Yes.
He's at supper.
Diet of worms.
Not where he is eating, but where he is eaten. Right.
And of course, the claim that Cecil was proud of being born in the year of the diet of worms, the church, convocation that occurred that year. I think that's part of the thing. And one other detail that I learned just very recently, Stephen, that shocked me because scholars have not commented on this, is that when Mary Queen of Scots was then detained and put in prison, and she spent months in prison, and then she had to sign the abdication papers, and that King James would be, and that her half-brother Moray would be the protector, that she would give up claim to the throne. Well, Bothwell was in the wind at that time. They had lost the battle at Carberry Hill. They had lost, so he was running from the Scottish lords who were in pursuit of him. He had a small navy. They sailed across the North Sea. There was some battles. He managed to escape several times. He ends up in Norway, okay? And it turns out he's in the same little town where a woman that he had a previous affair with and promised to marry lives. He has to do a settlement with her, but then he gets detained by her cousin. His name is Eric Rosenkrantz. He gets arrested in Norway by Eric Rosenkrantz, who then delivers him to the court in Copenhagen, and then from then he's set in prison and spends the last 10 years of life in a Danish prison. Like Denmark is a prison to me, Hamlet says. When he's saying Denmark is a prison, he might be referring to the fact that Bothwell spent the last decade of his life as a prisoner in a Danish prison. It's pretty amazing.
Well, and what's really interesting too is you draw these extra parallels because obviously there's the whole Denmark versus Norway as the subtext in Hamlet, right?
Yes.
There's this war going on. And when Fortinbras arrives at the end, right. And Hamlet says, tell him that he has my voice. But also talking about Macbeth again, it's Swano, the Norwegian king, who has corrupted the Thane of Cawdor,
right?
Who is the rebel
Yes.
against Duncan the king,
Right.
who, and nothing became his life like the losing of it, I think they say, when he finally is put to death. But so there's another sort of layer of reflection and parallel that's going on, is you have this rebel lord, this rebel Scottish lord, who is siding with Norway. And so Bothwell, ironically, where does he flee? To Norway. So that's a really interesting parallel too.
It is. And the Norwegian and Danish kingdoms were under one rule at that time during the time of Mary Queen of Scots. Okay. So there was only one kingdom that included Denmark and Norway. So it's very politically very, very interesting.
I wonder who that king was at that time.
Frederick, I think. I can't recall. It's in John Guy's wonderful book, Mary Queen of Scots.
Now, is it John Guy or John Guy?
G-U-Y. So
is he French?
No, he's English.
Oh, okay.
He wrote a biography also of William Cecil. So he's a Cecil and a Mary Queen of Scots expert. It's a 500-page book. I still have research to do on it. There's pearls in there, Stephen. Pearls.
I see. You've been mining. You've been mining the lower depths of this.
That's what we do. I'm a compiler. I don't consider myself a true scholar. I don't read Latin or Greek other than medical Latin. But I've been reading what people are writing 100 years ago, and the people who recognize the parallels between Mary Queen of Scots and the whole Hamlet story. Okay, going back 225 years to James Plumtree, he was the first one to make that proposal that this is topical of the situation with Mary Queen of Scots, her execution, and her history of having colluded with her lover to eliminate her husband, the King of Scotland. And so Plumtree pushes this, and then since that time in the 20th century, David Bevington has given it some attention, and but Lillian Winstanley, writing 100 years ago, really outlined where the Hamlet and Macbeth stories have topicality regarding the crisis represented by Mary Queen of Scots. That goes back really over a 20-year period of time, from her being deposed following the Darnley assassination and her marriage to Bothwell, and then her ultimately being trapped in the Throckmorton plot, right? And the Bevington plot, and the other plots that resulted in her being, tried for treason and subsequently executed.
So another thing that you pointed out, and that I saw in the stuff that you sent me ahead of time that I wanted to ask you about, is the poisoning aspect. Because we know, obviously in Hamlet, the ghost of Hamlet says, I was poisoned. Your uncle came while I was sleeping in my orchard. He came and he poured the poison in my ear, which is a very interesting way of poisoning somebody, pouring it into their ear, as opposed to forcing them to ingest it or lacing their food with it, or, they weren't going to stick it with a needle. They didn't have that yet back then, right? But the pouring in the ear is I wonder how prevalent that was as a way of
there is a story.
Committing murder.
There is a story. There is a historical reference that includes the assassination of the Duke of Urbino by a barber hired by his nephew, Gonzaga, not Gonzago, but Gonzaga, who rubbed an ointment in his ear. So the barber rubs an ointment in the ear, which has some kind of poisonous extract that gets absorbed and then causes the death of the Duke of Urbino. This is in 1535 or 38, somewhere in there. The Duke of Urbino was Castiglione's patron, and also the patron of many artists during that time. So he was well known in literary circles, and certainly the Earl of Oxford has been very familiar with the Duke of Urbino and his as means of being assassinated by his nephew.
Well, and then, that's why he has Hamlet ask for the performance of the murder of Gonzago.
Absolutely.
As the play within the play to get Polonius, or get Claudius to feel guilty and almost confess, right? But what I'm asking is, how did Darnley die? And was he poisoned?
Well, there is a story that is extant that he was poisoned and suffered a horrible rash from the poisoning, which, of course, what King Hamlet talks about. After the poison is poured into his ears, he complains of breaking out in a huge rash everywhere where his skin was weeping all over. So it suggests that the effect of the poison had systemic manifestations and the dermatologic manifestations where he formed the crusty skin and what was his healthy skin all turned bad. Well, that happened to Darnley. He was being treated for secondary syphilis, which is associated with all these ulcerations and horrible breath as the necrotizing tissue is being developed by the mercury they use to vapor mercury vapor to get secondary syphilis. Actually, the irony, of course, in all of this is that it resolves spontaneously almost 100% of the time. And only about a third of the cases go on to tertiary syphilis, where you get the dementia and the joint changes and the collapse of the nose and all the things that are described so beautifully in Timon of Athens and in Troilus and Cressida, where Thersites, or Timon go on rants describing the end stage of syphilis. But it appears that it's a question of, did he have secondary syphilis or was he poisoned? And that's the question that comes up from the historical standpoint. Guy will probably give me some answers to that question in time, but I do believe Darnley was sexually profligate and probably did pick up syphilis. It was a common infection during that time.
Well, and as you point out, it's referenced in multiple different plays, and that list even goes on and on. I mean, when you have Bottom talking with Peter Quince about what beard he should wear when he's
That's
playing. Right. And Bottom, and Peter Quince says some of your French crowns have no beards. And, when he's talking about the French crown, syphilis known as the French disease. And there was this, side effect of the disease that caused your hairline to break out terribly. Right.
Yeah, right.
Right now I kind of look like that. We were out rehearsing, and the only place I wasn't covered was on my forehead, and the mosquitoes attacked my forehead and bit me all over the place. And I made a comment to somebody. I said, if I were in Shakespeare's time, they would think I have syphilis because of the French crown. But it was such a common thing that it was talked about a lot, and it was very topical.
Yes.
And it was very common among the nobility, who were all sleeping around with each other and in places where they probably shouldn't be. And it was being spread. So I could see where that could be mistaken for if instead of poisoning, but also if there's some rumor of poisoning, usually there's, where there's smoke, there's fire.
Yeah. Well, the Earl of Leicester was probably best known for his poisonings, the alleged poisonings in Leicester's Chronicle.
Well, I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But before we get into that, I wanted to talk about there were also some rumors, and there's been some speculation throughout history that it's possible that John de Vere was poisoned and knocked out of the way at the time that Oxford was, 11 years old. And was it 11?
12. 11
or 12 years old, and probably for a variety of different reasons, but one of those reasons could have been in order to have control of all the Oxford's lands and leases by making him suddenly a ward of the court with his father dead.
Yeah, well, as the Earl of Sussex says, "You know not the gypsy," referring to Leicester as being somebody that probably eliminated his wife, Amy Robsart. She broke her neck falling down some stairs, right? And then the Earl of Essex suddenly gets ill and dies. And then, of course, he marries the Letus Knollys, who was formerly married to the Earl of Essex. So, his reputation as a poisoner is rampant. And, of course, he did attempt to assassinate Jean Simier, the ambassador for the Duke of Alençon from France. There were several attempts at assassination, and I don't know if poisoning was one of them, but one of them was a gunshot that occurred, and Elizabeth was in the vicinity. It was not well received, apparently, according to the Queen. So, yeah, he was not above political assassination, Lord of Leicester.
So that's where I want to get into the idea of him having murdered his wife, Amy what's her last name? Robsart. So I just saw something very interesting where they've discovered some new documentation about the autopsy of her body. And they found the documents in the weirdest of places where they shouldn't have been, where they didn't belong. And according to this documentary I was watching, she had holes in her head. She'd been struck with something sharp. She didn't fall down the stairs and break her neck. Her skull was fractured with a sharp instrument, not a blunt instrument, like a pike. Somebody hit her from behind with something piercing.
Oh, that's
twice.
I think a young woman, otherwise healthy young woman, suddenly dies. It's a suspicious situation, and the fracture of a neck falling down some stairs does happen. It could certainly have happened, but she certainly could have been struck and hit in the head and collapsed and fallen down the stairs altogether. The exact pathophysiology is uncertain, but
she was alone in the house too, which
Yes.
is very rare or
Right.
weird at that time for a woman of her stature to have dismissed all of the servants. And according to the inquest, she dismissed them all and sent them away. She was meeting with someone that she did not want the servants to know she was meeting with. And whoever that someone was killed her. And I believe, based on some of those details and based on the ramifications of what happened, and now talking with you about how Mary Queen of Scots was painted as this adulterer murderess, regardless of whether she was justified to end her husband's life or not, William Cecil destroyed her through that crime, let's call it. And then William Cecil successfully destroyed the Earl of Leicester through the crime of the death of his wife, because it does not do Leicester any favors. The Queen immediately distances herself from him when he was her right hand up until that point. He is forbidden from court. He's ostracized. He loses all of his claim to her. That opens the door for the Earl of Oxford to become the new dandy and become the Queen's new favorite, is right after Leicester's wife is found dead. I don't think he did it. I think William Cecil plotted that murder and then painted Leicester to look like a murderer and used the same MO he used against Mary, Queen of Scots.
Well,
That's my theory.
I don't think that you're alone in that theory. I do think that others have suggested Cecil may have been responsible for the assassination or the murder or however you want to say it of Amy Robsart, so as to undo Leicester's situation. As a Protestant, he could have divorced her and then married Elizabeth, but I think that would have been a real taint on her being the queen, to have married a man who was already previously married to somebody else. I think that would be a little bit of a problem for her, perhaps. But I do think it did impair his courtship of her. Now, the reason he really got thrown out of court was when he married secretly Lettuce Knollys after the death of the Earl of Essex. And the Queen didn't know about it. And guess who busted it? It was Simier, the French ambassador, who in front of Leicester told the Queen that he had married Lettuce Knollys, and the Queen banished Leicester from court at that point, was furious with him, wouldn't see him for a while. But then, of course, he ingratiates himself again. He becomes the commander of the Dutch forces, of the forces that go to the Low Countries, replacing the Earl of Oxford with Philip Sidney, of course. So this is in 1586. Okay, when the English get more and more involved in the Low Countries. And then he comes back and he's the commander of her land forces during the Spanish Armada invasion in 1588. So he did finally get himself back into her good graces at some point along the way there. But it's like a soap opera, Steve.
Right?
It truly is. And it's a dark soap opera where murder is possible, and political assassination.
Not only possible, but common.
Yeah.
And I think that when you look at some of these tragedies like Hamlet,
right,
what you're seeing is the dramatization of real life events. And I think that's what we've touched on here, is that you can look at the sources like the ancient Greeks, or even you mentioned, and I'd like to talk a little more about the Amleth myth and that source, because I think it's fascinating in itself. But you can look at those source materials, but then you can also look at the topical happenings of the day, and you can see that you're talking about a very tumultuous time and a lot of heads off of blocks, including Mary Queen of Scots.
Right.
You know, that she's one of the most famous ones, right? Because it took 2 whacks to get through her fat neck, apparently. And that's very well documented, right? And then when they went to pick up her head, she had a wig, and the wig fell off and the head rolled down into the people, right? I mean, that's like one of the most famous beheadings in the history of beheadings because of how what a debacle it was. Right?
Horrible, the horror of it all.
But that's the real world that these people lived in.
Well, let's go back to the very root of the theater in ancient Greece. Okay, the Greeks wrote topical dramas, but they posed them in mythical contexts. Okay, so when Oedipus Tyrannos, Sophocles' play about Oedipus the king, who's married his mother and has these children, and then there's a plague in Athens, and the resolution of it, of course, is that he's going to blind himself, she's going to commit suicide, the children will all go into horrible fates because of the incestuousness of this whole story. That is Sophocles, who's a general in the Athenian army, writing in 429 BC, a criticism of Pericles for the war policy to go to war with Sparta, and causing a plague in Athens because of all the people in the countryside are now hiding behind the Athenian wall. So the population of Athens triples, and now you have an outbreak of some bug, typhus, some kind of bug that's associated with a plague that occurs during wartime. And
crowded,
right,
unclean conditions.
You got it. So
under siege.
So even the Greek tragedians did this. Now the Greek old comedy of Aristophanes is in your face political parody and allegory, and even the characters in the plays themselves are named after people who are in Athens during that. Cleon was a tyrant after Pericles' death. Okay, he has 2 or 3 plays in which he attacks Cleon. He's sitting in the front row and he's attacking him right there. Oh, how about the clowns when he goes after Socrates?
Yes,
sitting up in a basket. I mean, the ludicrousness and this is cited 30 years later in the trial of Socrates when he's forced to take the hemlock. The Aristophanes face. So the fact that the dramatic tradition of old comedy and the great tragedies of the golden era, they were political. But they were using allegorical context, using mythological characters and parallels. So when the propagandists in the 1560s referred to Mary Queen of Scots as a Clytemnestra in ballads or in speeches to Parliament, the informed audience knows what we're talking about, that this is a metaphorical context, a parallel of a murderous queen who assassinated her husband and married her lover. It's just an amazing way.
All of these nobles, these high-ranking men and women of the time had access to those kinds of libraries. They spoke multiple languages. They read fluently in multiple languages, and so they had that context. They knew exactly when the metaphors are flying, it's painting the images in their minds because they're familiar with it.
Absolutely. I mean, think of the libraries that the Earl of Oxford lived in from the time he was a child. I mean, his father had an acting company, okay, and of course he ends up with 2 acting companies, a boys' company and a men's company and a company of musicians and a company of acrobats. I mean, he is supporting a whole pantheon of artists during that time when he's selling off estates and all. But he grows up with Thomas Smith, who's a known classics scholar, a translator of Greek. He puts on Greek plays of the Plutus, I think, and he did 2 different Aristophanes plays at Cambridge Universities in the 1540s when he was a chancellor there. In Greek, he's putting on Aristophanes plays in Greek at Cambridge, and he's got these Greek editions in his library. Then he goes to Cecil House when he's 12 until he's 21. He's living there, and they have all the collection of the Greek dramas there. And Mildred Cecil is famous for being a great Greek translator. Okay, so he was surrounded by people, and the literature was sitting there in the library. It's just an amazing thing. And these were Greek editions or Greek Latin translations that were published in places like Paris, or in Venice, or in European centers. Basel in Switzerland was well known for its dual language publications. But in England, none of those plays were ever translated into English other than or Latin, other than Thomas Watson's Antigone. And I think Lady Lumley did an English translation of Iphigenia et Aulis. So just 2 of the plays that were Euripides plays were translated, or Sophocles and Euripides. None by Aeschylus.
Well, and as a Shakespearean artist, I also have a great affinity for the Greek tragedies.
Yeah.
And one of the things, when I had my theater in LA, we did one every year. We did most of them in classical style. I've played Oedipus. My wife has played Antigone.
Wow.
We've done Trojan Women twice. We've done Medea. We've done Electra. I've done Electra with my students, and it's amazing to watch young kids embrace the story. It's a little bloody and violent. It gets a little strange for some of them sometimes, but you explain to them that it's, high art and it's high tragedy. I had, when Orestes and Electra, in the Euripides version, they sort of lure her into the house under the guise that Electra has had a baby.
Yes.
And that she, as the grandmother, needs to come and bless the child before the 10-day waiting period.
Yeah.
And they lure her in, and then she comes out all bloodied and falls and crumples dead. So what I did was I used like the old sort of Renaissance style where the young girl who played Clytemnestra comes out, and she's got 3 rolled up rolls of red fabric that are like strips of fabric, and she holds onto one end and throws the fabric, and it's like streams of blood shooting out of her, right? And it's just these red strips of fabric, and then she falls down dead, and they stand over her with the final blow. They both hold the sword together so that they can't either of them be blamed, right?
Yeah.
So when you have that kind of context of those stories and you see how they all tie together, you mentioned Iphigenia. I've longed to do that play.
Yeah.
I want to play Agamemnon in that play, and maybe when I do that play, it will be my own daughter playing Iphigenia. What a powerful scene that would be.
Stephen, I want to see you play Hercules in the Alcestis.
Okay.
You don't know the Alcestis, do you?
I don't.
Oh my gosh. It's the only tragic comedy. It's the one satyr play we have of the entire Greek canon. They did the trilogies were there, and then they had another satyr play to kind of lighten the mood.
Right. The fourth in the series.
This is Euripides. I think it's 429 BC that he wrote the Alcestis. But the final scene is an absolute source for the statue scene in The Winter's Tale, where Hercules brings back a veiled bride, just like Hero in Much Ado About Nothing.
Sure.
It's the foundation for both those concluding scenes. And then he forces the king, Admetus, to take the hand of this woman, this mysterious woman that he says he won in a competition. Turns out he had wrestled with death at the tomb and told death that he would never let him go, so he could proceed gathering other souls for the underworld unless he let Alcestis go. And then he lets her go, and he brings her back to the living world, and she continues to be the wife and mother of their children. A miraculous recovery from a woman who was presumed dead. Okay, that I could see Annie play Alcestis and you play Hercules in that scene. Okay?
Hercules. I don't mind me. I might have to do some push-ups though.
You could double down also as Apollo. There's 2 roles you could play on that one, because Apollo comes out and gives the prologue and says, "Oh, Death, you think you're going to come and collect Alcestis, just because I negotiated with the fates to take somebody in lieu of the king who was my friend, who protected me when I was banished from Olympus and on earth as a shepherd, so I owe the king something. So the only person who would volunteer to die for him is his wife, Alcestis."
Do you have a translation that you prefer, that you like? You'll need to send to me.
I'll work on that one. Yeah, I've got several different translations.
Generally, when I do the Greek tragedies, I look for the oldest translations I can find into English.
Yeah.
And they're almost always, I never use them unless they're in verse.
Well, let's see, it was T.S. Eliot's Cocktail Party derives from this as well. And I think Ted Hughes, actually the last thing that he ever wrote in his life was his own translation of the Alcestis. So I'll look for those. I'll work with you on this one.
That'd be great.
No, he clearly, and this was translated by George Buchanan, the man who gathered the dossier on Mary Queen of Scots. He did the Latin translation published by Henri Estienne in Paris in the 1550s. When he was teaching in France himself. So he did the Medea and the Latin translation of Medea and the Latin translation of the Alcestis. That probably was the source that Shakespeare used because Buchanan's works were in Cecil's library. And he would have been somebody well known to the family. He wrote sonnets to Mildred Cecil, praised her for her knowledge of Greek and all this sort of stuff. So Buchanan's translation of the Alcestis is critical.
Well, my company, we're due to do another Greek classic. So that would be a good one to put on our list.
Here's the thing. Hercules comes in. He doesn't know the queen's just died, that the house is in mourning. But Admetus can't turn him away because the Greek, imperative of hosting your visitor, who was your friend, he's come. He doesn't know the queen said, you don't tell him the queen died. You put him in the back room, and then he gets drunk and is strutting up and down and praising the goddess of love and how
I can do that.
We should all be drinking and having such a party, and the servants are going nuts. And Foss says, what's going on? Come on. Tell me. Didn't you know it was the queen that died? He's in mourning. He says, oh my God, I totally blew it. Excuse me, I'll be right back. So he runs down to the tomb, and you hear him relate later that he wrestled with death to get the body of Alcestis freed up and brought back to the world of the living. It's a wonderful tragic comedy. It's a source of so much that's within Shakespeare that's so cool. When Bottom says, I could play Heracles rarely, or a part to tear a cat into.
That's what he's talking about.
Yeah. The raging rocks and shivering shocks shall break the locks of prison gates, and Phoebus's car, the sun,
which shines from far,
and make and mar the foolish fates. He's talking about how Apollo negotiated the release of Alcestis from the fates.
Right, Phoebus' car. That's Apollo.
Yeah,
That's
Hamlet jumps into the grave in wrestling with Laertes. He says, "Let Hercules do what he may. The cat will mew, and the dog will have his day." What he's saying is, I'm no Hercules. I can't bring back the dead Ophelia. Okay, and when he says, the cat will mew, he's referring to the Nemean lion, the first of Hercules' 12 labors, and the dog will have his day refers to the Cerberus, the three-headed dog of Pluto.
And he's also mocking Laertes for his big show of course. All of that too.
But he's saying, I
can grieve just as much as you can. Right?
But he's saying, I'm not Hercules. I can't bring back the dead.
Right.
Hercules did that in this story from the ancient Greeks, this myth. I'm not that powerful. So he ties in all these subtle allusions to these Greek dramas through. It's like a golden thread that he weaves through a number of the plays. It's wonderful.
You have to imagine that such a great playwright is going to be inspired by the greats that came before him.
Yeah.
Whereas today you have great playwrights who might be inspired by Shakespeare. You have great playwrights today who are probably inspired by Chekhov and Inge and Ibsen and O'Neill and Miller. Now, Arthur Miller is old enough. Those works are now old enough that they're almost becoming classics. You know what I mean? Sure. Williams.
Yeah.
One of the things that you find about all of those playwrights is their works are not only influenced by those who came before and the source materials that they have access to, but also their lives and the topical nature of what was going on around them at the time. Right. And I think that that's the truth about the Shakespearean canon. And it's certainly one of the great truths we're seeing here with Hamlet is that it's source, it's classical, it's topical, it's autobiographical. The layers just continue. And then, because we touched on this, to pull all of that together on top of this interesting little myth, the Amleth myth, which is obvious. All he does is literally move one letter from the end of the name to the front of the name to go from Amleth to Hamlet. Right. It's not a stretch. It's a pretty simple one. But one of the things I love about that layer is the story of Amleth feigning the madness in order to accomplish his goals, and how our guy uses that in Hamlet in such wonderful and curious ways to allow him to do some of these things, like stab William Cecil to death on stage, for instance.
Talk about artistic license. License to kill.
I know. Who could possibly get away with depicting the slaying of the Queen's chief minister on stage in front of the court?
Only if they were all aware that what this drama was a parallel to Mary Queen of Scots and the assassination of Rizzio. It helps mitigate the obvious association with the personal connection, since the Earl of Oxford would not have been known as the author of this, except for the very, very close insider group, and that the certain precepts were not published during that time. So the whole advice to Laertes that ties William Cecil to Polonius, the original, thought about that. But it's layered.
His precepts. Neither
right.
a borrower nor lender being on the rest of those.
Yeah.
The one thing I'm really happy that he did not do with Hamlet, having played the role twice, is from the Amleth myth, we get the story of how Amleth goes and rolls around in pig shit.
Oh yeah.
In order to smell horrible and to play off his madness. And no, thank you. I draw the line as an actor. I draw the line.
Here's another piece of the story that Eddie Jolly writes about in her book on the first two quartos of Hamlet. That Belforet, the Bishop Belforet, who translated the Saxo Grammaticus original story of Amleth into Histoire tragique, tragical histories or tragical stories, that Belforet was also in the 1560s writing attacks on William Cecil during the same time that he was translating the Belforet, he was translating the Saxo Grammaticus stories and published them in Histoire tragique. So he's not only the source of the primary source because it's generally believed that it's Belforet's translation of Saxo that becomes the primary source. And Eddie Jolly's done a lot of work in that regard, but also that Belforet was part of the propaganda campaign that was attacking William Cecil for his role in the trial and execution for treason of Thomas, the Duke of Norfolk, the Earl of Oxford's cousin. Mm-hmm. So you've got this incredible...
Arundel?
No, not Arundel. Thomas, the Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard. Yeah. Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, who, was allegedly planning to get together with Mary Queen of Scots and marry her. Okay, this is after the whole Darnley affair, when she's sort of in house arrest in England during that 20-year period of time, that had made some moves in that direction, and that's what got him entrapped, and that's when the Earl of Oxford fled to Europe for the first time.
Well, and of course you imagine that Oxford has all of these reasons to hate William Cecil. And then in that context, there have to be others who hate William Cecil. We know that Leicester and Cecil were not tight by any means. So you would think that, birds of a feather sort of flock together. So here's Oxford maybe looking for allies against Cecil and finding them. And then in the course of that, reading the works that they're doing and getting inspired to do other works. And so that makes total sense to me that connection actually adds just another layer of how it all came to be.
Well, if you think about the Earl of Oxford's relationship with the Earl of Leicester and all, of course, Leicester had control of Oxford's properties from the time he was 12 until he reaches maturity. Okay, so Cecil assigned to Leicester those properties, apparently, because Cecil was the head of the Court of Wards and determined that. And of course, at the same time, he has the right to determine who Oxford's going to marry. Okay, so it's like he's really bound up with these people. And I think as far as the question of the Catholic versus Protestant, that Cecil and Leicester were kind of on the same page. They were both very much opposed to Mary Queen of Scots, okay? But Cecil was really the one leading the charge. In that regard, historically, and over many years, 20 years, he was campaigning against her and trying to entrap her in various ways. So I think that's it indicates that Oxford's feelings toward his father-in-law obviously changed over a period of time. I mean, as his ward for those better part of a decade, and then as his son-in-law. Who was hopefully going to get some kind of dowry. He probably was on decent terms with him, but things certainly turned sour after he went off to Europe and spent a small fortune and then came back and refused to be with his wife who had borne their first child. So that whole melodrama really must have turned, them into enemies.
And another layer onto the Greek origins of that type of storyline is that incestuous nature. Right. And it's interesting because there's a lot of incestuous behavior going on in the stories of these Greek tragedies, and the way they all connect one after another has always been fascinating to me. Like the whole Trojan War aspect of all of many of the greatest Greek plays we have all revolve around that. And if you look at going to Paris, stealing Helen, or even you can go before that, right? You can go with Menelaus winning by like drawing lots, right? And winning Helen.
Yeah.
And then Paris stealing Helen. And because of the way Menelaus had to win Helen through the agreement that everyone had together, that whoever won was going to be the guy and the rest of them would defend his right to have her. Now they all have to go to war. Yeah. So Agamemnon, Menelaus' brother's like, okay, here we go. We all promised we got to go. Let's go to war. Yeah. They screw up and they piss off Artemis, who says, no more wind. Your ships won't sail unless you sacrifice your daughter. The sacrifice of Iphigenia leads to Clytemnestra, leads to Electra, leads to Orestes being banished and coming back 20 years later. I mean, like it's this domino effect of incest that occurs, especially with Clytemnestra marrying basically her husband's nephew.
Right. After
plotting with him to kill him.
Who was born by Thyestes raping his daughter. Okay. So actually it was, not adulterous, it was incestuous.
Yeah.
But I guess this is the incestuous progeny of in a attempt of revenge himself against his brother Atreus. Yeah.
And what does Hamlet say? Damned incestuous Dane.
Right.
Right. And he talks there's that one of the best scenes in all of dramatic literature is what we call the closet scene, where Hamlet and Gertrude are alone together in her chambers, and where he chides her and he tells her and he says, do not go to my uncle's bed anymore. Like, what does he call her? A cistern of lust or something to that.
He refers to her as a mouse, which is another word for whore.
Yeah. He's like, he lays into her so severely there.
Well, Luís Schleiner, writing about the Latinized Greek drama and the source of Hamlet, writing 30 years ago says it's far more likely that this is an Orestes drama, not an Oedipal drama. That, the interpretation of sexual relationship between Gertrude and Hamlet is far less credible than the more hostile relationship, and that he's dangerous and more likely
agreed.
to kill her.
I never understood the whole Oedipal thing, and when you look at some of the famous film versions of it, they play that up sometimes, and I'm going, what? There's no text, there's no context for that. That is absolutely nowhere in the text.
Oh, Olivier took it to the limit.
But you're right. It's much more of an Orestes Clytemnestra relationship than it is an Oedipus Jocasta relationship. Right. And having played both of those characters, I think I have some context to talk about. I've played Oedipus, and I had a fabulous Jocasta until she killed herself. And then I gouged my eyes out. And I've had a fabulous Gertrude opposite my Hamlet as well. And those relationships are completely different. Yeah. And that's a fabulous point to make about that relationship. He attacks her.
Yeah.
Well, she's done.
The Greek sources within Shakespeare was appreciated by the contemporaries. Hayward and Chapman both wrote dramas after the publication of Hamlet that had cento-like scenes, but the closet scene, which are in Orestes dramas. So they're taking a Hamlet and using it as a source for an Orestes drama. Okay, so they see the circular connection between them. It's just astonishing that the contemporary playwrights, the well-educated people who were familiar with the classical canon, recognized right away that the Hamlet story was an Orestes drama, and then they would use cento, the text and dramaturgy, right out of Hamlet in a Greek drama that would depict the relationship between Clytemnestra and Orestes. It was pretty amazing.
So one of the things I think that's really interesting that's come to me through the various research that you've done and the stories that have connected, and the way, like, we have a great episode from the past that we did together about Macbeth and all of the aviary and the bird references and how much of the Greeks are involved in that play. And so if you haven't heard that episode, folks, you need to go back and find it. You'll find it in the library of episodes. But one of the things that I think is interesting to me is a lot of the sources that you discover and that you dive deep into, and I don't know exactly when Guy published his book, but you often refer to scholars that are from 100 years ago.
Right.
Or at very minimum, at least 50 or 60 years ago. Sometimes it's books that you mentioned that were published in the 50s or the 60s, but oftentimes it's the turn of the last century or right before the turn of the last century, where a lot of these scholars were finding these parallels and finding these connections and writing about them. And now they don't. Post 75, post 1980, at the latest, maybe it's harder to find people writing about these types of connections and these types of sources in Shakespeare. And my theory about that is that we did that. Oxfordians did that because now they can't explain it. Thomas Loney comes forward and says, how about this guy? It starts to become more and more uncomfortable for traditional orthodoxy to explain away all of this great knowledge and all of these great sources and all of this great context. And you start to see, quote unquote, Shakespeare scholars stray away from doing this type of research and connecting the plays to this type of richness because it's uncomfortable for them to explain.
Oh, you got... Writing in the 50s, J.A.K. Thompson, absolutely no Greek at all. Well, Macbeth looks like kind of a Greek drama, but no, he couldn't have known the Greek, not at all. Then you got the Martindales writing in the 90s. No Greek. Any association would be, unthinkable. Jonathan Bates said, well, no, he didn't know the Greeks. He learned about the Greeks from Ovid. Ovid taught him everything he needed to know about the Greek drama. And then other scholars come, no, it was Plutarch. Plutarch taught, he was a secondary way. He learned about Greek drama through Plutarch. So they cannot accept the fact that these editions who were unpublished, they may have been Latin translations, but certainly no English translations and nothing in England other than in those beautiful private libraries like Thomas Smith and Cecil's and John Dee's and other great scholars of that time. So it's very hard to explain. Now, there is one honest scholar who's an academic, Tanya Pollard, who published a book about 8 years ago, Greek Tragic.
Have you ever met her in person?
I'd love to have. She's my hero.
I know. I was about to say. I hope your wife. I hope for your wife's sake, you never end up in the same room as Tanya Pollard. You will probably run away, and we'll never see you again.
She's Greek tragic.
You have a crush on her brain.
Greek tragic women on Shakespearean stages, and she actually cites some of my work. Okay, so when a guy living in the rural Oregon, without any kind of literary degree, gets cited by a Rhodes Scholar, Yale graduate, tenured professor in a wonderful book that's an award-winning book. Yeah, you think that's the person you'd love to see.
Let's invite her to be a guest on the podcast.
I can reach out. I have her email.
Let's do it.
I'll ask
her
if she
out
wants
here
to talk about that.
Yeah.
She was actually up in Portland State in April. Couldn't go because I had my shoulder surgery, talking another topic altogether. But her book catalogs all the editions of the Greek drama that were published in vernacular or Latin translation in the various centers they were. And she really gives an honest appraisal that says, no doubt Euripides was powerfully influential on Shakespeare. She won't go as far as Sophocles or Aeschylus. That would be harder to do because those plays and those original Greek editions were much harder to translate easily. There was no translation of the Oresteian until like the 19th century in England, no English translation. So that language is very metaphoric.
Most of the versions that I use are translations of Euripides.
Yeah. Well, he was more popular.
Yeah, he's one.
We have 18 of his plays versus
them.
only 8, I think, of each of the Sophocles or Aeschylus. Yeah, we just have a fraction.
Occasionally I'll combine together.
Uh-huh.
I'll find 2 different translations that I like, this scene or that scene. So if they've both done an Electra, for instance, then I'll take the best of translations of both and sort of blend them together because I'm obviously doing an adaptation anyway. So,
I discovered something and it was embarrassing when it happened. And that is I used one translation to compare the Agamemnon to Macbeth. And the whole idea of the damn spot, Lady Macbeth, the spot that you can't wash, the indelible stain of royal assassination that you get, out, down spot. Well, in the translation of the Agamemnon that I was using from the trilogy, that was published by Oates and O'Neill. Eugene O'Neill's son was a great Greek scholar. Actually, they collected all the Greek vowels.
Why does that not surprise me?
Yeah. The translator, Addington, I think is his name, uses the word damned spot to describe the spot on Clytemnestra's face for the blood splatter that occurred. The chorus talks about the damned spot. Oh, there it is. The damned spot, the damned spot. Well, Rick Wagaman called me out on that after I gave a presentation on this a few years back. And I went and I looked at 7 or 8 different translations of that choric passage. And the idea of an indelible blood stain is there, but the use of the word damned spot is only in one of those translations. So I realized that to use a translation of something as arcane as an Aeschylus edition, you really need to look at multiple translations, just like what you do, Stephen, to be honest about where that words was. Clearly, Shakespeare's language influenced the translator of that Greek edition.
Okay, so let's go with guilty mark. I mean, damn spot, guilty mark, indelible stain. I mean, truly.
Yeah.
Okay, I get it. Obviously, it can become cyclical is what you're saying,
well,
right?
And it's far more than textual direct translation, okay? We're talking about the use of metaphors, images, dramaturgy, that are or rhetorical devices like the various, all the various Latin described or Greek based rhetorical figures and all. But the idea of stichomythia, the line by line back and forth, that's a Greek tragedy style. Mm-hmm. Well, Shakespeare uses that over and over again. Yes. Yeah. So you see that the influence of the Greeks was not just specifically text and plot driven, but it's driven by a lot of other aspects of the productions.
Well, and he does the same thing of returning to different themes and returning to different sources. And I mean, you could argue that, and this is, talking about dating the plays, but I would argue that the use of Mad Tom in Lear is another Hamlet myth inspired construction in a play. It's so, Edgar feigns madness in order to stay under the radar and prevent himself from getting killed by his half-brother bastard Edmund, who is, plotting and scheming. And it works. He becomes Mad Tom, this fake character he creates, and he does roll around in the mud and smear himself and put leaves in his hair and everything, right? Like that's a total Hamlet connection again. And I would argue that puts Lear after Hamlet in the sequence of the writing, because he goes, you know what worked really good in this tragedy, and I'm going to use this again, but in a totally different way. And it will play out at the end of this play, especially when he leads his father to the edge of the cliffs of Dover and says, okay, leap, right? Because Kent has been blinded, right? Not Kent.
Gloucester.
Gloucester's been blinded.
Yeah.
So I think you have, sometimes you see this evidence of something sticks in his mind.
Yeah.
And he uses it again and he uses it again and he's almost like he has this card catalog of sources that he's like, you know what worked really good in this play? I'm going to pull that one back out again. And people do that, playwrights have been doing that for, thousands of years, and musicians do it all the time. Oh, that riff right there, that sounds really good. I'm going to steal that riff and redo another song with that riff.
Oh, yeah. I love listening to Mark Knopfler because I can recognize his signature. He has a riff signature that he just came up with a new album.
From Dire Straits?
Dire Straits, yeah. Just a new album. You feel the artistic soul on something that has to do with the way he does a certain thing with the guitar.
That cat's been playing music a long time.
He has. Yeah. But Lillian Winstanley, who we're talking, writing in the 1920s, she identified numerous themes around the Darnley Mary Queen of Scots situation in both Hamlet and Macbeth and King Lear. And I can't tell you exactly what her arguments are about Lear because I haven't gotten quite that far in looking into her work. but she saw the political parallels that were in the tragedies that were reflective, topical political crises that were reflective of the primary problem that happened during Elizabeth's reign, from very early on in the 1560s with Mary Queen of Scots and her fate. And then 20 years later, the treason and the trial and the execution and the war with Spain and all the things that happened in the aftermath of that. I mean, the war with Spain, people generally don't appreciate the fact that it caused massive inflation in England. The cost of bread went up 2 or 3 times during the next 10 years after the Spanish Armada. We think the Armada was it. No, that war went on for another 15 years until James came to the throne, and it bankrupted all the money was going into the Navy and the military. That there was very little thing for the people, and the armies were not being paid very well, if anything. It caused a huge amount of social distress that came out of that conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics and the war of Spain against the English. I mean, it's just
that's
loaded.
One of the things you could say to the benefit of William Cecil is that he stabilized the English economy, or else they would have sunk. They would have been done because they would have gone broke, and Spain would have been able to just walk right in.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that he was certainly a master of, was running the treasury and, reinstituting the gold standard into the English economy was a huge part of that. And he helped fund a lot of what they were able to do to hold off.
Well, he funded a lot. I mean, he funded classical translation. He funded the munitions industry, the fishing industry. He helped the fishing industry. But what he actually brought, according to Michael Cecil, Lord Burleigh, our friend, he arranged for England to start making its own gunpowder and cannonballs. Prior to his time, they would have to buy that from continental sources. So he brought home production of a war economy materials that you needed to have if you're going to go to war. And of course,
he's the founder of the first industrial military complex.
There you go.
And look how it's been serving the world to this day.
Well, his descendants through the Robert Cecil line were prime ministers through all the important eras of English history.
Well, a lot of people say Robert Cecil is the great villain of the Elizabethan and Jacobean age, but the chip of that block was pretty close. That apple did not fall far from the tree. He learned it from his father. And William Cecil, for all of the great diplomacy and the great government stuff that he did do, he was an evil, scheming conniver, a power monger, and that's where his son learned all of his best tricks. I'm certain of that.
Well, I think I wouldn't argue with that, but when I had the opportunity to rave about the English Renaissance and the very important role of William Cecil in helping with the translations and supporting the scholars at places like Gray's Inn, I was in the company of the Marquess of Exeter's wife, Lady Cecil, Barbara Cecil. I did not know that she was married to a nobleman. I said nothing negative about her husband's ancestor, William. I only gave the positive. And that's when my friend said, "Do you know who you're talking to?" I said, "Barbara. Oh, are you related to the Cecil family?" She says, I happen to be married to Lord Burleigh. Oh my God. The serendipity was on my side. I said the right thing at the right time. So don't be insulting the Cecil family in mixed company. Be careful.
I'll tell you, Earl, I have always said this. There is no one better at diplomacy than you, my friend. You are the greatest diplomat.
I have ill-advised certain people at different times, but mostly I try to stay on the right side of history.
Yeah, your tact and grace are two of your greatest qualities, my friend.
Well, I worked as an ER doc, and believe me, you have to be humble to do that job. You have to be modest, and you have to be non-judgmental. And those are the things that have served me well in my practice of medicine.
See, I always heard the opposite. I always heard that ER docs are loaded with ego because they have life and death in their hands, and they get to play God every day. There's none of that?
That's the surgeons.
Oh, that's surgeons.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, no. Gotcha. ER docs are dealing with the homeless. They can't. Okay. You're dealing with what nobody else is willing to take care of at any time, day or night. You have to walk into each room like you're a performer.
You're also dealing with the foolhardy too, because how many people come into an emergency room only with themselves to blame for whatever it is that they're sitting there for, right?
And they are forgiven for that the minute you walk in the door. You put on a different hat.
What do you mean you shot a nail through your own foot while you were decking your redecking your back porch? Like, those kinds of things, right?
You could say, well, this is 2 guy points. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
you could make a joke of it if you find somebody willing to kind of relax around that a little bit. But mostly you just you read the audience. You have to read your audience.
And tell me, Mr. Smith, why did you shove that up your nose again?
You don't ever ask why.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we could do a whole side episode. We could do a whole podcast just on like weird stories from the ER. You might want to think about that.
Well, I think weird stories from Shakespeare's medical knowledge is another way to go.
Okay,
because he really hit all the marks. He had a remarkable knowledge of medicine, but then that's another subject altogether.
Well, I'm so glad. It's been great having you back here, Earl. And of course, there won't be long before you'll have something else you'll want to throw my way, and we'll see you again. But before I let you go, it's been a fascinating conversation about one of our favorite plays. And again, I'll say the greatest drama ever written. I do think that the folio version was for pure posterity and not to be acted. But that's just my personal opinion as a theater artist. But I think we're so lucky to have it the way that we have it. Oh. And we're lucky to have the different quartos and the different versions that I think best demonstrate the working process of this writer too.
Listen, Stephen,
he evolved.
We are so grateful to have you spreading the word through Don't Quill the Messenger podcast, and also what you took on with the Guthrie Theater and the Shakespeare in the Law and Shakespeare's Treason. Your listeners should know that Stephen has really stepped up in our region, and I've lived here for 50 years. It's a Shakespeare-rich region because of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, but Stephen has taken the bull by the horns and has created a whole coterie and putting on plays summer after summer out here. Besides the podcast, he's really been totally immersed in this. And I know that you're doing wider and wider reading. You've been at this for the better part of 5 years. And I just want to congratulate you because it's an astonishing means by which we're spreading the word and using all your various means of creativity to kind of spread the word about the love of Shakespeare and about the mystery of who wrote these works and the great, great stimulating and fascinating historical story that's behind it. We don't agree on all details, but I have a great, great respect for all that you've done, and congratulations, sir.
Well, thank you. My theory, one quiller at a time.
Well, I'm going to have to sign up for Patreon now. I'm sorry, Stephen. I'm going to have to become a true fan.
Well, and there you go, folks. There's the shameless plug. You too can become a Patreon patron by visiting our Patreon site. It's Patreon/Don't Quill the Messenger, or just go to don'tquillthepodcast.com. All the details are there. Don'tQuillThePodcast.com is where you can join our email subscriber list. You can find our Patreon. You can find the link to our Facebook page and follow us there and see some of the fun stuff we're doing on social media. And you can also email me. You know how to do that. contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. Earl, before I let you go, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention you are still currently, I don't know for not too many more months, but still currently the president of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. Is there any SOF news you'd like to share before we sign off?
Well, thank you so much, Stephen. Well, yes, we are having our conference in Denver this year in September, and we will be privileged to see a production of Hamlet directed by Chris Coleman, the artistic director of the Denver Center Theater. Chris is an Oxfordian, actually. He was formerly in Portland and affiliated with Concordia University and a friend of Dan Wright's. So we're very excited about our conference coming up. And those conferences are now being live streamed since our Ashland conference 2 years ago. We've been live streaming it so that people who can't travel, who are really interested in that, if they go to our website, we'll be posting real soon the schedule of speakers during that program. One other program that I'm really excited about is one that Professor Michael Delahoyde has been producing for us called Shakespeare Illuminated. And on June 2nd, I will be performing the role of Bottom in a discussion of Midsummer Night's Dream.
So, that'll be fun.
So much fun. So I think that's pretty much my report. Any of you who are interested certainly can go to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website. And,
Indeed.
We've got lots of resources there for you to follow. But I think on all the fronts that we can attack this question, Stephen, and podcasting and videos and in live theater productions and in scholarly works, we're really on fire here, buddy. We are moving forward. Elizabeth Winkler, and thank you so much for bringing her to Southern Oregon last year. Brilliant move, my friend. Her book, Shakespeare Was a Woman and Other Heresies, How Doubting the Bard Became the Biggest Taboo in Literature. We want to really push that book. I know you'd like to make people make gifts of that book. I'm underlining Stephen's suggestion. It's a marvelous read, and it gives you the historical context in which we've been living and working our lives here, but going back really over a century. She really capsulizes the whole question.
Indeed. So you have Tanya Pollard. I have Elizabeth Winkler. There you go. There's my brain crush. Yeah, she's so brilliant, and she's just such a charismatic and wonderful lady. She's so smart. She knows more about more things than I could hope to know. And the way they just come, like she can be in a conversation with her and just pow, 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 and like she's firing all cylinders, and I could barely keep up.
Well, the New York Times published her article on the birthplace trust fraud on Shakespeare's birthday on April 23rd. So she's continuing to chip away at the facade, friends.
Indeed, as we all are. And we thank you, Quiller Nation, for being a part of it. As always, thank you for joining us. Thank you for allowing me into your life every fortnight. And until next time, say it with me, Earl. Keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
Dragon Wagon.